Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and on this podcast, we're going week to week discussing a streaming favorite. In today's episode, I'll be breaking down the series finale, now officially announced, the series finale of Euphoria, the third season, a very popular and questionable as to whether it was successful or not. Let's leave that verdict to the commentary here. Just some quick show news before I get into my breakdown. On the podcast, the finale of Your Friends and Neighbors this Friday. A big deal here on the podcast, of course, a very popular show for us. And very curious to know if the season will land in a satisfying place. And that same night, this very week, the premiere of Cape Fear, a 2-episode premiere of this very highly anticipated and prestige adaptation of the original novel. I believe they're going back to the novel rather than, but I'm sure they'll have the influence of the 2 previous film adaptations as well. Very exciting stuff, and early reviews have been mostly positive. The Patreon is live as well. We continue to rewatch the Christopher Nolan films. I have a very busy week, given kicking off some new activities on my end in my career or launching a new career, which is part of the reason that Darren will not be here discussing this final episode with me. But Darren will be back with his commentary regarding this episode of the show when we discuss Widow's Bay in the middle of the week. And very curious as to whether he and his family went to see, or his children, I guess, went to see Backrooms. I did see Backrooms and have things to say about this surprising low-budget horror moment that the box office is experiencing and what it might foretell for a pivot in the films we might be seeing in the near future. You may have read the headlines. Of course, a massive opening weekend for this $10 million film with a less than $10 million or around $10 million marketing campaign, opening bigger than the Star Wars film from last week, which of course is expectations just budgetarily. We're talking about over $150 million budget, which is a bargain, by the way, by Star Wars standards, and a $100 million marketing campaign. And of course, this little spawned film offshoot of this online mythology basically self-sold itself to a larger audience, and of course, a hit overseas as well. And simultaneously, we have the continued phenomena of Obsession, another horror film, even cheaper, made for less than $1 million, with an even smaller marketing campaign, and now starting to grow legs at the box office all over the world. And I told you last week how unheard of, nearly unheard of it is for a widely expanded film to grow from weekend 1 to weekend 2. Well, everybody, if that's a rare feat, it grew again from weekend 2 to weekend 3, even against head-to-head with this massive opening of yet another horror project. So something's happening. These are both YouTube creators. What does it foretell for the future of cinema? I think it foretells some pretty good things. I'll save that commentary for Wednesday. Darren and I will discuss those movies in more detail, the box office success of both of them. And I can't wait to hear what Darren thought of this finale of Euphoria, given the fact that he's been more high on this show than I have this season, although I have some positive things to say as well. Oh, and of course, if all that content sounds interesting, follow us. Just follow our podcast so you get notifications when that content becomes available, or join our Patreon. There's a lot of free content there. All of it's free currently, and there'll always be content there and just a convenient way to talk to us and to talk to each other. Okay, before any of the Euphoria commentary, I received a couple of emails just this very week wanting my opinion on the finale of Half Man, another HBO series, which also wrapped up this week. For those that are not in the know, this film series has been running for only 6 weeks. It's a miniseries, a BBC co-production, I believe, from Richard Gadd, the creator of the phenomenally successful, this one less successful, I believe, pretty certain of it, the phenomenally successful Baby Reindeer on Netflix a few years back, which of course won all the awards. He has won so many Emmy Awards for that incredible and surprising and shocking and unexpected TV project. So we did kind of abandon this show here in the podcast. Darren and I were discussing it week to week briefly during the short Euphoria conversations. So track those down if you're curious to get our week to week impressions, although they were brief. Check those show notes for timestamps. And then I kind of fell off the show. I was very much waiting for the finale. I did intend to discuss it, but other things came up. We had a very extensive conversation on that horror film Obsession I mentioned last week and forgot to bring up this ongoing series. However, it's wrapped up now. And since I'm here by myself, all my lonesome this week, I did take time to take some notes on my opinion of this series. And I decided to frame it as 10 things. Maybe this will be a formula I follow going forward when I want to talk about something, but not spend too much time on it and also prevent my tendency to maybe over elaborate. So 10 things that I wrote down about this season of this show. So hopefully I satisfy you folks who were curious about my feedback. And of course, if you did not watch the show, this isn't spoiler focused, by the way, my commentary here. However, there definitely will be some pretty significant spoilers inferred in what I'm about to say. So if you do plan to watch the show, you may want to dip out of my commentary after probably point 2 or point 3. And again, check the show notes for this episode to jump to the Euphoria breakdown specifically. 10 things about Half Man. Number 1, this might have been better as a binge. Of course, Baby Reindeer was a binge. It created this incredible word of mouth phenomena, very rare to see, where it premiered on Netflix and had a few million views. Pretty good for this low budget series, but not topping the charts on Netflix. And then a week later, it was near the top of the charts for Netflix. And then the week after that, it grew yet again. Very rare to see a Netflix series grow from week to week to week. And by the time its run ended, even within this 3-month window that Netflix presents viewership, it had already become one of the 10 most popular series ever in Netflix history. And of course, then it won all the Emmy Awards and all the BAFTA Awards and many Critics Awards over the course of the year. So I can only imagine that audience, which was a record at the time, has probably doubled since then, which would, of course, make it one of the 10, maybe one of the 5 most popular shows ever on Netflix. Extremely rare to see this type of thing, although it happened again 1 year later with another BBC production or co-production, Adolescence. So given that, maybe, again, Baby Reindeer worked so well, I needed to take a break from Baby Reindeer about halfway through once the sexual assault occurred, because this was a dense and tough show to watch. And then the experience of watching this going week to week, HBO always goes with this week to week formula of release. I found it to be pretty tough going and to even skittish about returning to this really depressing and sadomasochistic dynamic week after week. Whereas maybe the morbid curiosity of it as a binge, I would have just kind of binged through it. But all that being said, hey, look, the show's now all available. If you haven't watched it or you watched the first episode and were kind of on the fence, if you are intrigued by it, it is dense and it is tough, but I don't actually mind seeing something that's very dense and tough as a movie, let's say, right? That kind of has a finite end. Like I know that no matter how rough this is, in half an hour, it's over. So I guess as a binge, although it's longer, like 5 hours and change, maybe close to 6 hours, it is like a really long movie. So that's rough in and of itself, but it is kind of just a finite experience. And I think, again, going back to my point one, that this may have worked better as a binge, but guess what, everybody? Now it's all there. So now you can binge it. And I am curious that there will be, if there will be some kind of spike in interest in the show retroactively, maybe because it gets award nominations. I do expect he'll get some here, and I'll get into where I think the show works best. Or maybe it'll just be the curiosity or morbid even curiosity given some people's negative reaction to the early episodes. Okay, point number 2. Surprisingly, this pairs well with DTF St. Louis. I do wonder more and more if there is some kind of curation process going on. I mentioned, as we were discussing Euphoria, that Margot's Got Money Troubles was an interesting parallel, exploring similar material about being in a society where you lack opportunities and then sex work becomes a legitimate line of work, and a pretty positive representation of it, warts and all, but a pretty positive representation of it on Margot versus the hedonistic and depressive dead end that it seems to be presented in Euphoria. So an interesting contrast. And now here, maybe this curation is only happening in my head and no one out there is actually sitting around trying to do this. And the questions I can't answer, obviously. But I do find it very interesting. We just recently saw DTF St. Louis. And in that case, we have these middle-aged men who are approaching this kind of crisis of the midlife crisis, but a crisis of masculinity as well. In one case, a very successful person who questions whether their life's work has any value at all. I'm a weatherman, but anybody could just look at their phone to do what I'm doing. And I get paid well to do what? Exactly what your phone does on its home screen by default. And then, of course, on the other hand, someone who's trying to be passionate about the thing they love, but there's no place in the world for that type of person, especially in the context of that type of male figure. So there's all these questions about what types of masculinity there is, what you're allowed to be as a man, etc. And while that, I think, is trying to explore more generally the midlife crisis or the loneliness of middle-aged men, we do have this interesting parallel exploration here in Half Man, where we have these two brothers who aren't really brothers, but adoptive brothers. And in this case, it's not like those middle-aged men who are so dissatisfied with their lives that they start to question that maybe the questioning of their place in the world may even include their sexuality, something that's barely brought up until the very, very end of the series. In this particular case, I don't think this is like a general appraisal of masculinity. It's very specific to these two men and their destructive symbiotic relationship. But in this case, we have not a questioning of sexuality like on the periphery of the topic or the show. It is the central conceit of the show itself. In one case, somebody who is basically homophobic to himself and gets trapped in this kind of perpetual adolescent exploration because he's unable to make emotional connections. And then on the other hand, you have this exaggerated macho figure who is overcompensating for a fear of his lack of masculinity. And again, ends up so trapped by this performance of this version of masculinity that again is unable to evolve emotionally, to have an emotionally satisfying relationship. So just fascinating to think about these projects in conversation with each other, if they are at all, but in my mind, couldn't help but draw some parallels. Okay, number 3. I missed this somehow. Maybe I need to rewatch the show now, although I dread the idea of it, considering what a rough watch it was, that there's so much comedy, especially towards the end of the show, and I somehow missed the comedy. And maybe this is an issue I had with the show itself, that I felt like it was such a slog, it was such misery, it was so difficult to watch, and there was no escaping this brutal presentation of this self-hating central character. And when you see how self-defeating he is over and over again, it became even more pronounced as it went on. And only in the last episode and a half, perhaps, the last 2, but maybe even less than that, that what I had read early on as like, man, when Ruben shows up and like the way his leather is creaking and everything is so over the top and his voice modulation is such an exaggerated version of this, his terror instilling masculinity, it felt melodramatic and it made me want to laugh at it. But maybe there was comedy there the whole time and somehow I missed it, because the comedy in the bleakness of the situation later in the episode is definitely there. And maybe I simply missed it. And just a few highlights in the finale. One is I find it absolutely hilarious. First of all, the presentation of all the activities in this bathhouse and just how jaded this bizarre milieu and, very foreign to most people, I would assume, is conveyed in such a nonchalant way, especially from these two characters who are so jaded by everything. And the hilarious reveal that Niall didn't even know his friend's name until he ends up, of all things, representing him legally. And then another shock of comedy as well in the most emotional and fraught moment in the episode, the confession through the plexiglass in the prison, when it's just kind of dragged out and dragged out. What else? Tell me what else do you have? What other secrets do you have to tell me? And the final reveal about who's the parent, the father of Ruben's son. And like a switch, seeing the the humor and this hatred come flooding back in. And it is such a pivot, is nearly cartoonish. And I think very intentionally, we saw comedy beats like this in Baby Reindeer itself. So comedy coming in the very darkest moments of the material. And honestly, I kind of missed that early on. So maybe it was there the whole time. So maybe part of the problem here is the tone, and maybe not even the tone in the writing. I, for some reason, thought that Gad was directing this whole thing. He actually had directors come in who've worked on, very accomplished directors, but this is a very difficult tone to balance. This trolling and then the comedy and then the horror all mixed together, that earnestness and then the pivot into the comedic. That's a very hard thing to do. And maybe that was the problem I had with the show in general, was this tone management, which is very much in the hands of the directors. But I don't want to just throw the directors under the bus, because this is a very, very difficult tone to pull off. And maybe everyone involved, including Gad himself, maybe don't have the experience necessary to pull off this balancing act. And that segues directly into my point 4. Not that only that I kind of missed the comedy, but part of that is that this tone management was off. So I don't know where to place the blame on that, but I did feel that as I was watching the show, I needed some comedy or some humanity to just break through. And it didn't happen until these last couple episodes. I actually thought there were moments in the last episode that not were like shockingly funny, but deeply emotionally moving. So I guess, and maybe that was the intention, to kind of save that as a cathartic moment towards the end of the series. And maybe that explains something we see at the very, very end of this whole entire show, which I'll get around to. Again, this may all work better as a binge. But going week to week, I couldn't really get my head around the intentionality of a lot of this. Number 5, the one-on-one scenes between Belle and Gad. I mean, the younger men have a couple really great heart-to-hearts, but the older characters, once we finally, and it takes a long time to get to this point, but once the show is primarily this two-hander, or at least have these extended sequences between Gad and Belle, this is where the juice in the material is. Of course, the conversation between the behind the plexiglass, the prison scene in the finale, but also that protracted hospital scene earlier on, nearly half the episode perhaps, or maybe more. And when they are actually talking to each other and working out this, instead of passively aggressively manipulating each other and letting things go unsaid, it really speaks to the fact that catharsis probably would have prevented a lot of the tragedy we see here. And also it just allows these actors to flesh out these characters, add shading to them that is lacking sometimes in the one-note repetition of some of the brutality that's on display over and over again. So these scenes are excellent. And this goes back to the idea that this probably will be in the Emmy conversation at some point, at least, even if people, and this is a mixed reaction, but mostly positive to the show, even if there is no nomination for Best Miniseries, certainly these performances will probably get some kind of award recognition, and possibly the writing. I don't know if the directing will. It's open to. It depends on your taste there. I think that the directing needed to be able to pull off this tone, which is difficult, but it is the job, right? Okay, number 6, Half Man. So as I'm watching this, especially in the very early going, I was thinking that this title itself could be more metaphorical, and maybe this would work in a movie that I discussed this briefly, I think on microphone, where you could imagine a version of this series where Half Man represents these two men are half of a man. The two men together make one person. I think that given the experience of these two men, even in the context of the show, it is way too broad to say this is about masculinity, all of masculinity. I don't think that's true at all. It's very much a narrow perspective, of course, but there's a version of this show that represents that this is like an interior conversation within an individual. So this back and forth and this performance of these different versions of masculinity and this shame cycle within one person becomes what drives all this negative psychology. But given the fact that we travel through decades of time and they have external characters, different mothers, and there's all this biographical detail, doesn't allow this kind of squinting psychological read that maybe a movie would work better. Again, I'm a fan of movies, so I think like maybe this should have been a movie. And I think that movies allow you to be a lot more flexible in how you tell these stories. Having a extended series, even just 6 episodes, requires a lot of architecture, a lot of ballast to define this world that the characters live in. And sometimes the more you define that hazy reality, what I should say, what is allowed to be hazy in a movie, that it makes things too literal and allows things to be less interesting to me psychologically. So anyway, point being that half man is an interesting concept if we try to read this as an interior conversation. And like an analogy I'll make is, for example, David Lynch, one of my favorite, maybe my favorite director, in his film Lost Highway, my favorite way of reading Lost Highway, and you could do this for Mulholland Drive as well, by the way, but definitely for something that I don't hear people explicitly call out as much with Lost Highway. I prefer that read that film as those aren't 2 characters that we're following, but they are basically an interior conversation of one character, the duality of a single character who has the same hang up. Regardless, you could be younger, you can be older, you can have completely different socioeconomic backgrounds, but your psychological hang up is the same. And of course, maybe I'm overreading again, but I think about Lost Highway when I'm watching this series. And especially with that name Half Man, you can imagine this being this kind of 2 halves of a whole, let's say. And I would have preferred that. And I think that definitely is there. If a lot of what I'm overlaying on my read here is an actual interview that he gave to the New York Times that I heard. He did a weekend interview with them. And he mentioned in there that a lot of the dialogue in the film was conversations he'd had and even just internal monologues he'd had with himself. So it's like he's externalizing that, putting it into these 2 different characters' minds. But the more fascinating read for me is this interior battle that might be occurring in a single character. And all that is to say that it might be there. Everything I'm describing might be there. It might have worked better with an even more abbreviated runtime, like maybe a film. And then that segues directly into my point number 7, which is the autobiography of this. In that same interview, not only did Gad mention the fact that he has this entire, internal monologue that has been externalized into the mouths of these characters, which of course influences my read here. But he also mentioned the fact that until he was sexually assaulted, he had never explored that part of his sexuality. He had never even encountered it, not that he's aware of anyway. And how he's conflicted about that he doesn't want to make a statement that the assault is what led to his sexuality or the change in his behavior, but it is his personal experience. And then when you think about that, and maybe I'm overreading here, but if you lay that autobiographical detail onto the story he tells inside the prison, not that, he's never claimed, just to be clear about this, I don't want to mislead anybody. He was assaulted, for those who don't know, by a mentor, not by a father, but I guess you could say like a father figure perhaps in a way, but not his dad. As far as I know, there's absolutely he has a good relationship with his father. But when you do think about Ruben's confession from behind that plexiglass, which is just absolutely devastating to hear, and Gad's emotional performance in the moment, it does make you think again about that internal conversation he had with himself of maybe that was a level of intimacy, even as unwanted as it was, that he had not experienced before, and how that you have to just assume when you hear that. My heart goes out to anybody who's had a similar experience, that how devastating and how confusing that must be to your psyche, like to your self-definition. So not surprising at all that it broke this man, this character. But Gad has come out of this in a very successful person. So he's turned it into something brave and brazen, I should say. So he's made something positive of it. Okay, point number 8. All those things I just said, the bravery of this, the experimentation of it, the great performances, the impressive production, the incredible level of ambition, and a real desire to break the mold. All that being said, this actually didn't really work for me. This series didn't actually work for me. It was too brutal for me to watch, especially on a week-to-week basis. Maybe, again, can't even rewind my brain and try to just experience it as a binge. But going week to week, it was difficult and oftentimes repetitive. All of this intentional, I'm sure. And it didn't seem to really pay off in any way that you kind of don't see coming a 1,000 miles away. And also, even my read on the show, it's me grabbing different things, like the emotional moments that worked, some of the symbolism that worked. It's me cobbling this together. It wasn't my experience of watching this show. I had to almost like retroactively recontextualize what I had seen to build this pretty positive argument around the show, but it's not my experience of watching it. So as I mentioned, I like so many parts of this, and admire it, but it didn't really work for me. Point number 9, what is up with that final scene? So a couple of things I want to bring up in regard to the final scene, because I haven't heard many people say this at all online. So I got to get it out there. First of all, a great scene in the episode that in a way encapsulates maybe the point of all this, which is, again, the confession, Ruben confessing to the abuse he suffered under his dad. And of course, in parallel with all this, Niall's revelation that he's been so afraid of telling Ruben about his sexuality this whole entire time has stolen his potential open life from himself because of this. But then Ruben's confession about his dad and about how his body reacted sometimes to the intimacy. And he says, is this too much? And first, Niall says, no, it's not too much. And then he's like, yes, it is too much. And again, maybe that's the whole project here in a nutshell. This whole show sometimes just feels like too much. And maybe that's intentional. It wants to confront us. This is trolling to some extent. And it happens in his stand-up, a Gad stand-up. It happened in Baby Reindeer. And it happens here again, where there is some intentional trolling. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, like trolling oftentimes can be considered. But I mean, he wants to confront the audience. He wants to make you uncomfortable. And is this too much? Am I telling you too much? Is he asking himself, like, am I saying too much? Is he asking the audience, is this too much for you? It doesn't seem to be like he wants to rub it in the audience's face, which is the type of thing that bothers me. It does feel like he is earnestly trying to connect, and he's saying, wait a second, is this too much? Am I telling you too much? But I do wonder, is this too much? In every possible way. And of course, let me go back to the final moment where these two, here's the big spoiler for everybody, but it's already been spoiled in episode 4. So we had already known earlier on that Ruben is dead. Now it turns out they're both dead. Of course, they are half men each, one man together. One can't survive without the other. So that's the metaphor. But literally, Ruben has choked out Niall. Niall has stabbed him in the kidney or somewhere. And apparently he's died as well, because now whether he killed himself, perhaps this wasn't a fatal wound and he's killed himself and now he's being dragged out at the end. Or maybe he did bleed out and that small knife actually did get him in an organ that killed him. That is actually left to our interpretation, whether Ruben did himself in or just died from his wounds. But here's the thing that no one's talking about. I literally had to Google it and barely found any commentary on this at all. But not only during this violent altercation between the two of them, not only is there a lot of like heavy breathing, especially when you see Ruben afterwards, like really presenting as this is post-coital. And then the very last shot, what appears to be, guys, tell me if I'm wrong on this, email me, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com if you've watched this. What seems to be 2 semen stains, or at least one, but regardless, I think 2 semen stains. And it makes me think, and of course, even like this kind of embarrassed look from Ruben, like kind of rolling his eyes like, oh boy. And that embarrassed revelation that this was all some kind of protracted foreplay between the two of them. It's a brutal comedic punchline, but also very reductive, I think, to the themes of the show itself. Which leads me to number 10, too much everywhere, everybody. And what I would say, Mr. Gad does not need any advice from me. He is a multi-Emmy award-winning, BAFTA-winning, HBO courted follow-up series having, and I'm sure whatever he does next will also be equally anticipated. This is a little too much. But all that being said, I appreciate that it exists. I would prefer that someone takes a really big swing and doesn't fully succeed than to just make another generic rom-com or something. So he went for it. He had this incredibly high bar to clear. He has to be more attention grabbing, more at some way a step forward from Baby Reindeer, this phenomena that he could not have possibly predicted. And he did it. This was not the disaster I anticipated early on. It's mostly successful. It has some very strong points. Even if you see it as a failure, it's definitely not an embarrassment. Just its ambition, and where it does succeed, he's doing something completely unique. But next time, don't set your own bar so high, my friend. It's a unique voice. It's a fascinating point of view, but it doesn't always have to be earth-shattering. And I do hope he just makes something light next time. You want to be subversive, make a rom-com that, sneaks you into some subversive territory. Make a rom-com about sadomasochists, whatever, something that is, subversive in that it presents one way and then sneaks you in to another unexpected avenue. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. So maybe too much ambition. However, I love the ambition. So it's a very mixed experiment for me, the reaction to it. But I'd rather have it than not. So kudos for it even existing. Okay, so as usually is the case for me, my brief 10 points about Half Man turned into a half-hour diatribe. Let's see how much better I do with my breakdown of this last episode of Euphoria. All right, in very briefly, the finale of Euphoria, which is called In God We Trust, is both a very technically assured and, again, very well made, some excellent filmmaking here, suspenseful, clever, some outstanding performances, but in the service of a completely confused and ill-defined point of view, period, in my opinion. And the more you try to impose a read on this season of the show and the show in general, the more unfocused and underdeveloped all of this actually feels. Of course, importantly, In God We Trust is not only about God, something that this show has been seeking all season long, or Rue specifically, but it's also written on all of our money. It's written on all of our money, people, and there's a lot of money raining down in this episode. Okay, as the episode opens, we go directly into where we left off in last week's episode. Rue grabs this huge wrench, smashes Wayne in the leg. Of course, Faye has screamed out to wake up Wayne. Rue does have the bag full of the materials that Alamo was after, mostly these driver's licenses. She punches Faye in the face, knocks her out temporarily, and then goes in this through this underground maze that, trying to place this, there's a lot of 70s exploitation that I'm probably seeing here. I mean, it makes me think of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, not 1, but 2. Not sure if that was the reference point or not. And by the way, you should watch, if you aren't exhausted after the 1 hour and 30 some odd minutes of this episode, you should check out that behind the scenes. There's always a featurette at the end of the episode. You should check out the production of this particular sequence. They built a 40-foot long cave system that was supposed to be well over 100 feet long. And they do that by having this forced perspective. So it's pretty cool to see someone enter the cave where they look like giants because of the scale difference, and then they're racing down the hallway. So just a very cool way to have a limited set that looks like a very long corridor. I'm always really impressed by these artisans that pull off these like nearly impossible and clever set design tasks. And of course, if anything else to call out here, the cinematography, the set design, and even the performances, the editing, the suspense that's built across this protracted sequence towards the end, for example. All of the technical expertise here is excellent. And even from moment to moment, especially in those narrated sequences, we don't get them here, unfortunately, in this particular episode, but especially in Rue's narration, these beautifully written sequences. Now, are all those different components put together in a way that gives a satisfying whole or defines some kind of point of view or gives good closure to these characters? I don't think so. My personal opinion, not really. Maybe here and there, Maybe a few of them get off better, but in general, not quite. But the individual components are always watchable and excellently produced. Rue escapes. She's running away. Harley comes, lassos her, again from the behind the scenes. Great to see that this guy's an actual cowboy and actually is riding a horseback. And so hire someone who knows how to do these things. And this is very cleverly done. They show you how they shoot the Zendaya being dragged behind the car with a camera mounted to it rather than a horse. But anyway, if you like that type of detail, it's all in the feature at the end. Very clever. But of course, so many references. At this point, it becomes near caricature that there are so many times that people have to like jump on a horse and all this cowboy iconography here. Of course, it's the wild, wild west, at least at this version of the West. And despite being sleeping in the cab earlier in the episode, Marshawn Lynch does wake up just in time to snipe our cowboy. Doesn't kill him though, but injures him pretty severely so that she can make her getaway. And then, of course, this is the most tragic element of the episode. Maddie unintentionally brings up the DEA. Oh, I should mention before that, of course, very importantly, another very well mounted sequence. We have this ambulance returning from Mexico. The girls have had their plastic surgery. They're on the way back. And a very clever detail, which is not fully revealed until later on. Alamo's man is driving and tells Laurie's man, they've gone on this mission together. To get out of the car, he should go inside. No, you have to come with me. Oh, yeah, right. And leave the car unattended. A car full of drugs. Good point. We should split up. And this great detail, he's got his Coke with sugar, by the way. Down in Mexico, they still have the OG Coke with sugar. I think it tastes better, especially out of a glass bottle. Ice cold, nothing better on a summer day. And of course, he wasn't done with it. So by the time Laurie's man comes back, he's like, what happened? And he's like, I thought you were done with it. I threw it away. But of course, we've seen he's been talking to Bishop. There's something afoot. And this is one of the great set pieces of this whole season of the show, and beautifully photographed as well. The ambulance on its way back. The DEA is closing in. The animals sense something is going wrong. As the DEA closes in, Laurie can't handle going to prison. The other guys, even though they say they're going down in a blaze of glory, eventually just put their weapons down and turn themselves in. And perhaps get off with just some minor weapons possession charge or something. Because it turns out the fentanyl is not in that ambulance. Of course, Bishop has taken that ambulance with the Coke bottle still in the cup holder, swapped it out for this other ambulance. So when the DEA pulls up the boards in the back of the ambulance, there are no drugs. There's just a rat. So the switcheroo occurred, and the fentanyl glides across the border in a separate ambulance, piloted by Bishop. So Laurie kills herself. Wayne and Faye escape and are never seen again. Not in this show anyway. Although they get picked up by some they hitchhike and are get picked up. So the Nazis get a pass. Laurie can't be caged like her birds, kills herself. But of course, if she had just waited, this whole case might very well fall apart. That's a legal aside. I mean, I think that even if they find stuff in the house, it's all fruit of the poison tree, I think they say, is the legal terminology, I think, or colloquialism. Any lawyers out there, let me know. What could they catch these people on? Maybe some weapons charge, like I mentioned. But then if they weren't supposed to be there in the first place, they wouldn't have found the weapons. Is that inadmissible? But of course, to close the loop on this part of the story, the drugs get to Alamo. Alamo has a heart-to-heart with Rue. Look, you're injured. You did really good. You're my MVP. Look, here's some Percocet for your pain. He knows full well that he's just handed her a loaded gun. Not only has he put fentanyl-laced pills in there, but he knows she will not be able to turn it down. So it is a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but he has handed it to her. Of course, we see that moment where she's getting her stitches put in and she doesn't even notice because she's so high on her Percocet. She goes and stays with Ali. And that night, sleeping on the sofa, she takes one of the fentanyl-laced pills. She believes she's woken up and she hears that Fez has escaped, runs back to her home neighborhood to intercept Fez. Of course, in the moment, you're even like, well, aren't you giving away his location if this was the case? But all of this is to find her way back into her mom's house. And they have this emotional embrace. But all of this, of course, is a death dream. She has OD'd in the night. And as we saw last week, Ali is devastated that he has yet another name to write in his diary, yet another lost soul that he could not save, yet another phone call he has to make to another parent. And in that standalone Euphoria episode from years ago, we have this whole conversation where Coleman Domingo, once again, great in this role, by the way, absolutely great. But Ali talking about finding grace in the misery of the world and trusting that there is a grander plan and having empathy for even the worst of us. And now saying, I have no more empathy, really refuting everything. You're either making the world better or worse. Empathy is weakness, something that disturbingly has been said quite a while. So extra disturbing to have it put into the mouth of like the moral center of this show, to be honest. And of course, this leads him on his revenge track, a veteran in uniform with a sawed-off shotgun. Again, going back to the 70s exploitation influence of this. You think Rolling Thunder, of course, one of Tarantino's favorite films, and of course, the Tarantino influence of this whole episode and this whole series in general. But before he goes off on his revenge quest, we actually have the show give us a version of the ending of the series with Rue's death and all of her friends, Ali, Cassie, Maddie, and Lexi, reflecting on this loss and all of this loss. There's a little ray of light here. We have Cassie tragically in this home by herself. Now, not only mourning Rue, but of course, primarily mourning Nate. Whether he really deserves to be mourned is a whole other question here. But she does. There is a hint here that maybe she'll start some kind of house for these TikTok girls or these OnlyFans girls. And the camera pans out. Again, very interesting choices being made here, but this camera panning out from this dollhouse, this giant house with its dollhouse-like design, and her alone in this giant estate, which of course was paid for with made-up money. I'll leave it for some of my points at the end, though. But of course, there's a lot of talk about God here. I'm reading the Bible again. Everybody's reading the Bible here in this episode of the show. And there is a spiritual longing that perhaps everyone's coming back to after being saturated with earthly goods and chasing after status, chasing after money, chasing after fame, chasing after a bigger butt, like just your physical assets. Speaking of a bigger butt, I have to bring up the fact that Kitty has this amazing prosthetic butt. This actress is wearing this prosthetic butt, which looks insanely real, but of course, completely disproportionate to her body. And not to the actress, who has a lovely body, but to Kitty, you didn't need that. You didn't need that. It was nice, all very proportionate before. Fan of the previous appearance. But of course, all of this leading up to this revenge mission. Ali, now in his full uniform, sawed-off shotgun in a bag, shows up at the Silver Slipper, puts a bike lock on the door. What's up with security at this place? You don't have security anymore because Laurie's out of the way? No one showed up in the interim because it's a pretty long time before he starts to shoot people. Maybe people are outside texting, hey, what's going on? I can't get inside. Who knows? And this scene just ratchets up. It's very tense, very well done. And before you know it, one of Alamo Brown's guys gets shot. He lied, not allowed to lie. Marshawn Lynch, that is. And once that gun goes off, obviously things accelerate pretty quickly. Very briefly mentioned here, I guess it was teased earlier. Bishop does seem to be a little sweet on Lexi himself. And they have this kind of sweet conversation when he goes to pick her up. And she was, at the moment, actually meeting with Alamo. Oh, I should not cut this part out, by the way. I have to mention the fact, because it's going to be important to some of my commentary later, that Alamo confesses, we'd seen him disturbed at one point, looking at what was happening inside the club. And he had an epiphany. He says this multiple times and mentions it to Maddie. The epiphany he had was that he has been making money off of women his whole entire life. This original sin that he's trying to overcome, the manipulation by his mother. Of course, her leg, iconically, the center image of this entire show, the leg above the club, the strip club. He still is controlled by it. He still wants to go back to that fantasy of the atomic family, the white picket fence, and the wife and the children. It's kind of amazing that this performer is able to pull this off just in his face. You feel this longing in him that something's wrong even before he says it out loud. But this is kind of ridiculous that this character would have come to this so late in his life. Maybe he's just feeling old. Hey, we all feel old eventually. But it didn't really ring true for me. And I do want to put a pin in that for later. The gun goes off. Maddie, by the way, playing it super, super cool here. But we know that something's about to happen. Maybe he hasn't sexually assaulted her that many times, or maybe not since the previous episode, or maybe not in that episode either. Maybe all of this he's been a little more, or trying to seduce her more than he would in other contexts, like he did with Kitty, because he wants more from her. And of course, even here admitting that he wants her to be his wife, potentially. So unclear exactly how physical they've become with each other, but there is a hint that it's definitely a risk, because Cassie has said it's better if you pretend that you enjoy it, which of course goes back to something that Darren said last week about his revelation that maybe the sexual relationship between some of the girls in the club and Alamo is less consensual than it presents itself to be. Just because the girls are playing along doesn't mean it's actually consensual. And here we have it again, since we're in Maddie's POV. She dreads this, but then of course in the moment plays it off like, hey, we're all good here. But then of course the gun goes off. Marshawn Lynch gets killed. Everybody's freaking out. Ali calls out specifically for Alamo. Kills a couple more of these guys in there. Alamo emerges, smashes this window by throwing a steer's head through a two-way glass. And then he screws up. He uses Maddie as a human shield. And Bishop is watching, always watching, and hands him a revolver, his golden revolver, his preferred gun, but unloaded. So that by the time we get to the full-on cowboy iconography, as he swaggers through the swinging doors, cowboy hat on, and wants to have a standoff, and has Kitty roll the bottle, no one can draw until the bottle breaks. But of course, he pulls the gun early. He's a cheater. And Bishop does not like that he used Maddie as a human shield and is standing right by him. If he needs to intercede, he will if anybody cheats. And of course, theoretically, if Ali draws early, he can shoot Ali. But if it is Alamo who draws early, he has no bullets. And he does draw early, and he dies for breaking the rules. And that is the end of Ali's terror revenge mission. It looks like everybody else is like, we're good. I'm not going to shoot this guy. I just want to get out of here. Can you unlock the door, please? And what else do we have here character-wise before we get to the very end? Somewhere along the way here, we see that Jules, horribly underused here, by the way. The artwork, by the way, I am pretty sure now, I was surprised earlier episode. The one compliment I made was that it looked like Hunter Schafer was doing her own painting. And indeed, this is her own artwork. So very interesting artwork here. This beautiful painting of Rue, her sugar daddy wandering around in the background. So this is her situation going forward. Completely underused, but like, as I said, one of the worst offenders here of how badly underutilized you have as a character is definitely Jules here. Cassie and Maddie. Maddie comes home with the money. Bishop in his now 70s, or it's, I guess, maybe even hippie styling. Perhaps they have hit it off. Maybe they're going to have a future together with this beautiful dog. Some comedy here, by the way, when Bishop asks somebody to watch the poodle and they cover the dog's eyes during the shooting sequence and then tuck her into the bag. Like, maybe it's better if you just don't. Well, let's just put you away here just so you don't get hurt. Someone's looking out for the doggy, at least. Lexi, I guess, continues to write on her, or maybe not, right? They want her to be a creative director, but then she turns it down. Is it because you read the Bible? I don't know what's going to go on with Lexi. She could go work for the OnlyFans house and write a narrative for these girls. Again, this kind of starts feeling like Margot's got money trouble. Or she can go legit and keep working in the Hollywood system and try to climb her way up. But if we use Maddie's trajectory, she didn't have any kind of financial success until she went out on her own. So who knows? I guess Lexi's kind of left out there. Not really central to this show anyway. And of course, very importantly, we have Ali shows up at this ranch where Rue had spent time all the way back in episode 1. We find out that his name is actually Martin McQueen. That's his actual name. And he mentions that Rue had been found this place to be the most peaceful place she'd ever been. This teenage daughter who had idolized Rue, heartbroken to find out that she's dead, had fantasized about a life beyond the ranch. Rue had warned her, don't ever leave. I would switch with you any day of the week. They all hold hands. Ali says grace, tears streaming down his face. Beautiful performance here again by Domingo. He opens his eyes. He sees Rue at the other end of the table. She smiles. Earlier on in the episode, we'd heard that her smile just lights up a room, makes you want to smile, and you can tell a lot about someone's smile, whether they're a good person or not. And there's that smile, Zendaya's radiant smile, warming Martin McQueen / Ali's heart. And the camera pans down, the American flag waving, God bless us all, says Rue. The only narration I believe she does in the entire episode. And that's the end of the episode. And that's the end of the series, by the way, not renewed beyond this season. I'm pretty sure, I don't think it's the ratings, which have been pretty strong. I think, but it was expensive. There was some behind the scenes stuff. So maybe HBO didn't really want to renew the show, but I don't think Zendaya wanted to come back. She wanted to wrap up Rue's storyline. Rue being dead really makes this feel like there's no reason to continue Euphoria. Is it possible you could come up with a very clever pilot with some of these other people? It's possible, but is Sydney Sweeney going to come back, considering how busy she is with all these films coming out in the near future? The other main characters are dead. Jules is completely underused and doesn't seem like the creators of the show have that much interest in this character anymore. So I can't imagine this bleeding into or spinning out some other Euphoria side project, unless you go back to high school and reboot the whole thing and just start with a whole new slew of high school kids. But the controversy around that would probably not be worth it in HBO's opinion. But for these characters, I think this is it, and I don't think we're going to see them again. And as far as Euphoria, branded Euphoria, no such thing. There will be no more Euphoria seasons. All right, I hope you enjoyed that show, if it did work for you. But now I'm going to give you all the negative commentary on this. I have to go. I've been wrestling with this the whole entire season, and now I kind of want to just lay it all out there. I've been waiting. This show in general, you think about Euphoria as a project from the very beginning, and in those earlier seasons, there is a read of this where you can say, this is so crazy that this show about these incredibly promiscuous kids in an era where kids are abstaining more and more from everything and are less promiscuous than before, are less often using drugs. Of course, these drugs are extremely more dangerous. I don't want to minimize that at all. So you may have more ODs, but in general, these kids are less experimental. This show came out and became started a firestorm of controversy, mostly on the right, even though I have always felt this show is reactionary to an extreme in all regards, but primarily it is reactionary in a very conservative, a morally conservative point of view. It feels like an after-school special with extreme content, although everything that's presented is presented in a more liberal leaning. This generation, the people that inhabit this show, are definitely leaning in that way. And the critique from the right wing has always been that just by presenting this in this glamorized way, that it is promoting this as a lifestyle brand for teenagers. Teenagers watch this and they would, in just presenting even the ugliness of this world, it's a very ugly world, but just in the hazy dreamscape and the incredibly well-designed sets and these attractive actors and the tone of the show, it becomes advertisement for this toxic lifestyle. It glamorizes it. And what I would say is that the tension between those two things made it very hard to read, although it did feel under it all morally conservative. My general rule of thumb would be like, make the conservative moral argument in each episode as you're watching it, and you will pretty much align with the point of view of the episode or the trajectory of that character. And that's kind of where I felt it was conservative under the covers. However, that's fine to be conservative under the covers. It's fine to be subversive in some ways. That actually makes the material more interesting to me anyway. So that tension in it is kind of what made me come back to the show after I had originally rejected it and then eventually started watching it. It was that tension between what it was trying to say, what it was presenting, its reactionary nature, oftentimes the grace that these actors, I should say these characters are asking for, but then like the often simplistic moral of the story. But that tension was interesting. And some of these characters at least sought redemption, even if they didn't always achieve it. But this third season has been extremely problematic for quite a few reasons. First of all, there's been a lot said about how this show has always been misogynistic, but now this season specifically has been extremely misogynistic. And going back to my original point, in the high school years, when these girls the women were the drivers of all the plot, the women who are in this third season, plus others that have left the show, the women always seem to be the drivers of the plot itself. So even if it wasn't the most flattering version of it, it was still a world that even as these women were trying to win over the jock, they were, that men did exist in the periphery of the story and were so central. Like Rue's absent father is her origin story for her addiction, for example. So as important as that all is to the framework of the themes of the show, that primarily the POV characters and the drivers of the story were the women themselves. And now you have them entering into the real world, no longer in high school, and immediately all these women end up directly or indirectly in sex work. That the world, and this could be what the show is trying to say, the world itself cannot see these women in any other context other than as sex objects. And then this being a capitalistic culture, they need to sell their sex to make it in the world. And you could say there's a broader critique here. No, it's not only about the girls. Think about Nate. Nate borrowed all this money and he got into so much trouble. So it happened to Nate as well. So the criticism is to living in this world, coming out out of high school or college into a world where the only value is monetary and making money or presenting wealth by any means necessary. But it's all undermined by the fact that A, there's pretty much only one male character to counterbalance all of these women in sex work, and that's Nate. And B, I think that everybody would agree that Nate's character is like probably the least interesting arc of any character here, other than maybe Jules, is Nate's character. So it's almost like he's forgotten by the end of the show. They kind of just brought him in to square the circle. You have this incredibly famous actor, but that did not seem to be thematically what the show was interested in at all. So in the end, the show seems to be aggressively misogynistic in presentation, but that could be text to the show itself, right? That is the reality. These women had agency in high school, but then now they're in the real world and no one can see them as anything other than sex objects. And you could say that that is what the show is trying to draw your attention to, except for the fact that the characters themselves are become damsels in distress, right? You have Rue in this very episode rescued by Marshawn Lynch when she looks like she's about to be dragged back to torture and possible death back at Laurie's farm. We don't even get her narration. At least we had her narration before, but her voice is literally silenced in this episode. Cassie is trapped by trying to rescue Nate and then trapped by Alamo himself into this servitude. All these girls are locked up and endangered because of this face-off between Ali and Alamo. Maddie never fights back in any meaningful way. She is used as a human shield and then rescued, like literally taken by the hand and walked out by Bishop at the end of the episode. So all these girls have lost their agency and all these men are out there seeking revenge or doing whatever they need to do. And even in the finale, literally Rue, the narrator of this series up until this point, has not only been silenced, but Ali at the dinner table. Oh, first of all, Ali shows up to be like, I'm here to avenge Rue. So now Rue is like a symbol that needs to be avenged. And worse than that is when he says grace and he sees her again for that moment. And again, I don't think this is even intentional. I think it's just the byproduct of a confused writing of this season of the show. But Rue is completely silent and is just smiling. And just it's almost insulting and reductive, definitely reductive, this idea of presenting Rue as like, yeah, she ruined a lot of people's lives. She almost got people killed. She may have actually gotten some people killed. She's done some terrible things. She messed up her life, her sister's life, her mother's life. A lot of the people around her have their quality of life is worse because of the decisions she made. And I'm not saying she's a villain. I'm saying she's a very complicated character, and she gets reduced to a smiling face. And despite all that complexity and all those horrible decisions she made, she's a good person because of that smile that makes you want to smile. And it is just like, almost like by removing her from the show, we now can just kind of look at her and smile and be like, she was a good girl. And it is so honestly insulting to this character that it really left a bad taste in my mouth. And no less so than the end of this episode, also coming back to the fantasy of this homestead, that this is where she was the happiest. And very importantly, I went back and rewatched episode 1 intentionally to see the interactions between Rue and this oldest daughter, who she's like, oh, I envy you. I want to get off of this farm. I've never been on the internet even. And she says, don't do it. And the show seems to be like, you stay with daddy, stay on the homestead, girl, because the world out there, the modern world, is a terrible world. And don't go on the internet and don't leave daddy's embrace, because you'll end up being a hooker somewhere. That's just what's going to happen to you. And I know that is a very simplistic read that I'm laying on it, but I mean, it is very easy to read the show in that way. And if that's not intentional, well, that is what they presented. And I actually don't mind if the creators of the show are trying to make a conservative moral argument. It's just that this is not a satisfyingly complete thought. It's really just this, honestly, think about it. Alamo, who's the villain here, his origin story that we find out is that his mom betrayed him, and that was the beginning of his hatred against women. And now I'm going to bring in some extra textual stuff here, but I can't help but think about this, having watched The Idol, which I don't recommend, by the way. But if you did watch The Idol, also made by Levinson, which was a series that originally was directed by Amy Seimetz, and she butted heads with The Weeknd as the star and originator of the concept of the show, because she wanted it to be very darkly comic, and he wanted something closer to maybe Levinson's perspective, because in that show, you literally are watching a character be sexually abused week after week by the man who's her Svengali, only to find out that even in all of that abuse, she was actually the one who was really in control. And he, the abuser, the physical abuser, the one who's committing the abusive acts week after week, leaves like shell-shocked, like, oh my God, she was always controlling me, which honestly feels like almost like incel logic. And it's exactly the same talking points that Alamo has when he's talking to Maddie in this very episode. And worse, the fact that this might be intentional is that it might not be intentional. It's just cobbling together different scenes that are kind of cool, very well made, and some fascinating character details and biographical elements. But put together, they either say nothing at all or make a potentially contradictory point than the creators were trying to make. And all of that made this very unsatisfying and minimally really confused in whatever it was trying to say. And I think with that very negative screed there, I think that's most of the thoughts I had. I was hoping to have a co-host on this episode, but I will definitely run this by Darren when we discuss Widow's Bay this upcoming week. It's only one episode and it's a short one, so we should have enough time in our conversation to circle back on this episode of the show, and I can read some social media reaction and see what other folks are saying. Do they agree with me? Do they have a cleaner read on this season of the show? A more generous read of it? Very curious. And of course, if you have a very positive view of this, or you want to push back on any of my points, I would love to have that interaction with you. Email us, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. Comment on Spotify or on YouTube or on the Patreon, which is free for everybody. So feel free to contact me any way you want. And Tell me if I missed something here in my read of this. And of course, remember to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. There's a lot of content coming out in June. Cape Fear, big premiere, lots of movies. This is, of course, the peak season of some at the US box office, I should say. And we'll be discussing all of it here on the feed. So make sure you subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you haven't rated us before. You enjoy the content, give us a positive review. And if you'd like to support the show, recommend us to your friends and family who may be watching these shows as well. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.